Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Bible class here at Holy Cross Lutheran Church in Kitchener, Ontario, on this Mother's Day. And before we forget, we'll wish all the moms out there a very happy Mother's Day, grandmas, and all the rest of them, great-grandmas, that the day be blessed. Here in Kitchener, we've got a lovely sunny morning so far, so wherever you are, we hope it's a good day as well as you gather together as best we can in these times. Some places can gather, some can't, and so we are where we are. Okay, we'll keep going here, and we'll hope we don't cause any more problems along the way here. We'll get started. We're in the book of Esther, and this is our third week of what will probably be a 6-week Bible study, taking us through to the end of May. It's quite likely, I think, that we will be continue to be in lockdown here until the end of this month. So we will work our way through this. If you're joining us and have never joined us before in Bible class, we have a place where you can go to get the information for the lesson, and that is our webpage, www.holycrosskitchener.org. And if you go there to the webpage, you will be able to download the lesson sheet. I will say this, I'm deeply, deeply thankful to Debbie, one of our staff, who uploaded the lesson sheet yesterday. I prepared these on Tuesday, and every day since I was going, yes, you have to forward that sheet to the office so they can put it up online. And then yesterday, as I was getting ready to do some final work on this, it occurred to me I had never done that. And so this morning, I'm very thankful that Debbie was able to help us out quickly yesterday. And if you have any questions during Bible class, I have my cell phone with me here, and my email address is there. And you're quite welcome to shoot an email at any point in time during the class with a question. We'll take a few breaks along the way where we consider the questions that or comments that have come in. And as is our habit here at Holy Cross in the Sunday morning adult Bible classes, we know that people are just getting up and getting going for the day in many cases, and they're having their cup of coffee and trying to get themselves organized and into the program here. So we'll give you a little bit of break while you're doing that with some little pieces of internet glory that I have gleaned over the past few days. Here's one. This is in the category of things that we introduced last week, which is kind of COVID stupidity, reaching new levels of stupidity each and every week. You're probably getting a little bit too carried away if you are, as this driver has done, putting masks on all the air vents in your car. Nice idea, not necessary, rather dumb if you ask me. Now, it is not my place here to wade into too far into the whole business of who gets vaccinated and who doesn't. I realize that's a conscience-based decision for many people, and respect all sides on that particular discussion. But my son-in-law posted something that I thought was pretty interesting, and because sometimes we object to certain things because we don't know all the details about what's inside. Well, think about this a little bit. If you've been eating hot dogs and McChickens all your life, but don't want the vaccine because you don't know what's in it. A little bit of an inconsistency there, I would suggest. Nobody really knows what's in McChicken, and while I have suggested that just about anything and everything could be in a hot dog, I'm told that's not exactly true, but you're certainly not eating pork tenderloin when you're eating the hot dog either. So if you're going to object, just be sure you have all your logic firmly in place there. All right, big funeral this past week. In some part of the world, the magician's assistant passed away. And sadly, the trick went wrong, and anyway, off the assistant went. All right, we don't need to belabor that too far, but anyway. All right. Now, this is a church sign. Sometimes church signs can be the source of great amusement. This is from a Lutheran church in the United States. It's a member of the ELCA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America. Now, this is not my place here to point fingers at what they are doing, but I just want to highlight one of the key differences between ourselves in Lutheran Church Canada, for example, and some other Lutherans. Now, this particular congregation, it was on August 13th of some year or another, having clown-led worship. Now, I'm going to say to you this, very carefully, this is not an insult, or no intended insult. We in Lutheran Church Canada also have clown-led worship. We just don't advertise it on the sign each and every week. And speaking of those clowns, this is a more serious picture. Here are a group of us from the Kitchener Circuit who were able to gather on Friday to make an honor guard after the end of the funeral for Pastor Roger Winger, our beloved former visitation pastor here at Holy Cross, who had also served as our district president, as a missionary in England and in parishes throughout Ontario, including historic St. Paul's downtown. And here are some of the clowns that lead worship in our neck of the woods. Pastor Rapp from over at Messiah, Pastor Schroth from Wellesley, myself, Pastor Fry, and far in the background, in black, just to distinguish herself from all of the rest, is Lenora, our deacon, our director of parish services. And we actually filled the entire street from Queen all the way to Frederick there as we paid respects to our brother and to his family at the time of his passing. All right, that's a little bit of introductory stuff to get us going here this morning. Now let's get into the book of Esther itself. And just a reminder, if you're joining us a couple minutes late, that the lesson sheet is online, and you can ask questions at any time. We'll just see if anything I've said so far has caused great upset in the world here. I don't think so. I usually make it through this part without upsetting people. All right, we're good there. All right, last week we did a big chunk of Esther chapter 2. And Esther chapter 2 tells what we called last time the seedy Cinderella story of Esther and her ascension to the throne and her ultimate coronation as the queen of the vast Persian Empire. And just to fill you in, remind you of some of the details of that story as we get ready to finish out chapter 2 this morning and deal with chapter 3. The whole story began, of course, when Vashti was expelled, the former queen, for her refusal to parade herself before the king's drunken party. And after a little bit of time where he sort of cooled down and came to a bit better understanding of what he had lost, the King Xerxes, through his officials, issues a decree that the young women are to be brought to his harem, and Esther is among those. She hides her Jewish nationality, but she wins favor in the court, and ultimately is selected to be the queen. And we talked last time about how there were certain moral compromises that were made along the way. The fact that she withheld her Jewish nationality is seen by some to be a compromise. The fact that her audition for the job was basically spending a night with the king is also seen by some as it is a very clear contradiction of God's moral law. And so what do we make of this when we've got the people that are supposed to be at the center of the story, and the people are the role models, are the ones who are also the ones in sin. Now, I think we're just going to have a brief thing here as we change. We're going to go to a different microphone, I'm guessing. Yeah. All right.
Yours is ticking a lot.
Mine is ticking a lot, apparently. Okay. So we'll just bear with us here for a second.
Channel 12. Okay.
Channel 12. Are we being heard? That's fine. That's okay. That's all right. Okay, we're on channel 12. As long as you can hear me, I can. That is fine, and I will proceed. Sorry about the problems there. I don't know what's going on with my particular machine here this morning, but it isn't in a happy mood. All right. Where we ended the class last time was with a recognition that one of the things that God is at work doing here, one of the things that, in spite of all the moral issues that are happening, that God is still at work, and he is using these imperfect people and their sinful actions to bring about his good and gracious will. And there's a comfort in that for you and for me. We all make compromises. We all have chapters of our lives, maybe long chapters, maybe short chapters. It depends on the situation. Where we have made compromises, where we have not done God's will, and where we may look back on that and not really have any great pride at all. But at the same time, God's love is so vast, his grace is so expansive, that even in those times where we don't follow his will, where we don't go his way, he is able to take what we have and the mess we make of our lives, even the blemishes and even the blotches, and use them, redeem them, transform them into something far greater than we could ever imagine. And that's kind of where we left things last time, and where we'll pick things up this morning. We're in the closing verses of Esther chapter 2, and this is where the story begins to get interesting, and we move kind of to the central event of the book of Esther. We are going to be in Esther chapter 2, verses 19 to 23. And some of you have commented, and I appreciate the constructive comment, that it would be helpful again to have the Bible citation right on the screen where you can see it, and we will continue to try to do that, and I apologize for the first couple weeks for neglecting that. All right, let's read what happens here in these final couple paragraphs of chapter 2. When the virgins were assembled a second time, these are the women who were gathered together and were made to be the candidates for the new queen. Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. We don't know exactly when this second gathering of the young women happened. It may have been sometime later. It may have been as a kind of a conclusion to the entire process of selecting the queen. We're not really sure where that happened, but it's just kind of a bit of a summation sort of statement. Esther kept secret her family background and nationality, just as Mordecai had told her to do, for she continued to follow Mordecai's instructions as she had done when he was bringing her up. And then just a little footnote here, Mordecai is a cousin of Esther, but significantly older, and when Esther's parents passed away, he assumed the parenting role and was the one who brought her up, more or less as his own daughter. Now, during this time, following Esther's coronation, Mordecai is sitting at the king's gate. We'll come back to that in just a half a second here. He's not loitering. It kind of makes it sound like he just sort of hangs out, like one would, outside of Tim Hortons or something like that to catch up on all the gossip in the neighborhood. But that's not what's happening here. He had a job, and his job happened to be in a building called the King's Gate. I'll show you that in just a half a second. Bigthana and Teresh, who was also known as Little Thana, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. Now, why would anybody want to assassinate such a nice guy as Xerxes? Well, he's given people plenty of reason to be frustrated with him at this particular point in time in his life. Not only has he had this major embarrassment with Vashti, his wife, and shown that he's kind of not in control of his own household, so to speak, and his marriage is a bit of a shambles. He's also, by this time, lost a second attempted invasion of Greece, and that brings shame upon a ruler. When you undertake a battle in those days, there's really only one outcome the people are prepared to hear, and that is that you won it. And to have extended his troops as far away as Greece, suffered significant losses, has probably irritated a lot of people in the kingdom as to why did we even try this? What were you thinking? Isn't the empire big enough for you already at 127 provinces? At any rate, and maybe even the selection of Esther herself. Maybe these guys had their money on somebody else and were frustrated that Esther was selected. We don't know, but Xerxes has certainly given people ample reason to be frustrated with him, and they plan to assassinate him. Now Mordecai finds out about the plot, and he tells Esther, who in turn reports it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the two officials, Bigthana and Teresh, were hanged on the gallows. Now, here nobody really knows exactly what's going on, but probably hung on a post, perhaps even impaled. They died a miserable, miserable death, that is for sure. And nobody in those days, when it came to capital punishment, was looking at slow or quick and painless methods of bringing this about. The whole goal was to cause agony and misery to whoever it is that you were executing. Now, all of this is recorded in the book of the Annals in the presence of the king. That's a helpful little footnote to bear in mind because that will be significant a little later in the day. So Mordecai does this great thing for the king, and it's reported, it's noted, and he's able to do this because of the place where he is working. The king's palace is the place where he works. Now, this isn't quite as big, perhaps, on your screens at home as it could be, but this is the palace of Xerxes, as best we can determine it. And his throne room was right here in the heart of the palace. The harem was kept right behind the throne room area, and there were a number of different courts in the palace, a military court, a second court, and then the inner court. And where Mordecai worked was out here in one of the outbuildings, which was simply called the King's Gate, which was the main entrance to the palace. There's another western gate over here, so this is on the east side of the palace, and there was a building there with numerous offices and places for people to work. Different officials had their place of work there, and this is where Mordecai worked. So he was within the palace grounds. He had access to the palace and to certain members of the royal family, including the queen. And so it's in that framework, in that context, that he overhears the plot and then reports that to the king. And if you, like me, and you can see this on your screen, are wondering what an apadana is, this is just a little footnote here. This was a kind of a pavilion, a semi-outdoor pavilion that had columns around the outside and then a giant canopy over the top for hosting gatherings kind of in the open air. This is probably the area here, between here and the Royal Gardens, where the big banquet was held, the one that went 180 days, and then the shorter one going only 7 days, rather, where the queen was brought forward. At any rate, Just keep that part of the story in mind. It's a kind of a little isolated incident, but it's setting up something a little bit important, quite a bit important for later in the story. All right, with that, we'll move into Esther chapter 3. I'm not seeing any questions coming out of our discussions so far. Where the story takes an unexpected turn. Chapter 3 opens with the decision of the king to honor a man named Haman. Let's just read the first 6 verses, just the first couple verses. Actually, we'll get started. We'll work through the first 6 and talk a little bit more about Haman as this unfolds. After these events, after all this plotting has subsided, and here, just to give you a bit of a time frame, we're probably talking about 4 years after Esther is crowned. So the whole middle of chapter 2 to beginning of chapter 3 spans about a 4-year period. King Xerxes honored Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than that of all the other nobles. All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. Now, one would expect, given how chapter 2 ended with Mordecai saving the king's life, that he would be the one who is honored. But Haman is honored. Now, we are not really told why it is that Haman is honored. Was there something else that Haman had done? Was this a deliberate snub against Mordecai? We're not told any of that, and all kinds of assumptions are made as to why and how this could have happened. Best not to get too far into that. I mean, there were many officials in the royal court, and it was the king's right to appoint whomever he wanted to appoint, and so he chooses to appoint Haman. Now, just a little bit about Haman. We introduced him very, very briefly back in the first lesson. He is an Agagite, and we don't know too much about the Agagites, generally speaking, except that they are descendants of the Amalekites. And the Amalekites we do know something about. The Amalekites trace their roots right back to Esau, the twin brother of Jacob in the Old Testament. The Esau who has his birthright taken from him, the Esau who's tricked out of the blessing. And one of his grandsons is named Amalek. And he moves away from the rest of the family, and over time his descendants become a nation in their own right. And they wage war on Israel already in Exodus chapter 17. Which is just after the people of Israel have come out of their captivity in Egypt, and as they are making their way down to Mount Sinai, before anybody else takes exception to their travelings, it's the Amalekites who do so. And so they kind of have this special place in the minds of the Israelites as this first nation that ever attacked them. And Samuel identifies them a few centuries later as enemies of Israel. And then in the days of King Saul, they attack Israel again. And at this time, David, great King David, is the commander of the army, and he defeats them. And throughout the history between these two nations, they are like sworn enemies of each other. An ancient version of the proverbial Hatfields and the McCoys, continually sparring with each other. It doesn't take much. If one says black, the other is going to say white, and the fight is on between them. And the hatred and the hostility simmered for a very, very, very long time. And Haman is an Amalekite, and Mordecai is a Jew, and they are not set up to be best friends. And that is apparent when Haman does not bow down and pay honor to him. Let's read on a little bit further. Mordecai would not kneel down and pay him honor. Then the royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's command?" Day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. Therefore they told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated, for he had told them he was a Jew. So his identity is known. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down and pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. And on the screen you see a belligerent Mordecai over here, taking a seat, not standing, not kneeling, not bowing, not showing respect in any way to Haman, who's presumably the guy under the umbrella here, and a very helpful official pointing out this failure, or perceived failure, on Mordecai's part. Well, that sets in motion, then, a series of events that really can only be described as a planned Holocaust, a planned wiping out of the Jewish people. And as we read through the next couple of paragraphs of chapter 3, we see that there's really three stages to how Mordecai develops his plan. And the first is using one of the time-honored methods of making decisions in the ancient world, the casting of lots. And the lots are similar to these little stones that are shown here on the screen with little markings on them that have significance to the people who are casting them. They were called pur, P-U-R. That's another little footnote to keep in mind for when we get to the end of the book, because it is out of this story that the Jewish festival of Purim, the festival of the casting of the lots, is, and the preservation of God's people, ultimately, that is celebrated. Well, let's read from the scriptures themselves. We're picking it up now at Esther chapter 3, verse 7. In the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month, the month of Nisan, which has nothing to do with cars, they cast the pur. They spell it with a U. I thought I got it right. Look at that. That is the lot, in the presence of Haman, to select a day and a month. And the lot fell on the 12th month, the month of Adar. So they cast lots to determine when this execution of the Jewish people will happen. And it is selected for 12 months down the road in the month of Adar. Nisan is the first month of the year, Adar the last. Kind of like casting the lots by our calendar in December or in January to reveal a date in December. Now, we do know with some certainty as to when these things happened, and I'll tell you that in just a half a minute. Now, the next thing he has to do is get support from the king. So he's got his plan, he's got his date. And so Haman said to King Xerxes, "There is a certain people dispersed and scattered among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all the other people. They do not obey the king's law. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them.
If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will put 10,000 talents of silver into the royal treasury for the men who carry out this business." So the king took the signet ring off his finger and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. "Keep the money," the king said to Haman, "and do with the people as you please." Now, the story here is pretty straightforward. Haman promises 10,000 talents of silver for his, he will pay the king if the king allows this. 10,000 talents, just to put that in some kind of context, is about 2/3 of the entire tax base for the entire empire. That one man would have that at his disposal is completely impossible. What he's probably referring to here is that he will plunder the Jewish people, take everything that he can possibly gather, sell it, and then convert all of that as a tribute to the king. Now, the king says to keep the money. What that means exactly was, there's no way he would want Haman to be the richest guy in the whole kingdom, so we're not really sure what exactly was going on there, but bottom line is he comes away ready to support the plan, and as a sign of that, gives Haman his ring. And in those days, right up until actually not all that long ago in the world, rings were used by leaders to, put the official seal right on a document, that this document came from the king, and so Haman is given free license to write up his edict and put the king's seal on it and seal the fate, if you will, of the Jewish people. Now, we just have a question that's come in here. Would people have been expected to bow down before the king? If so, would Mordecai have done so? Yes, people would have been expected to bow down before the king, and yes, Mordecai would have done that sort of thing. It is clearly about the only reason that really comes out as a reason why he will not bow down for Haman is this tension between the two of them. And this, who knows behind the story here, whether these two men working in close quarters in the palace already had some kind of simmering animosity between them based on Mordecai's Jewishness and the long-standing upset between the Jews and the Amalekites / Agagites. So it's quite possible that there's something kind of simmering in the background here, and these guys probably weren't best of friends in the first place. And when Haman's finally exalted, Mordecai says, "That's enough. I'm not bowing down to this guy. He's against me, and I'm against him, and it is life in a sinful world, I suppose. And so he will not bow down to this guy." All right, good question. All right, the planning then continues with the final stage of it all, the drafting of the edict. And this begins at chapter 3, verse 12. "On the 13th day of the first month, the royal secretaries were summoned." Now, we do know a date for the drafting of the edict. We can come pretty close anyway. May not be the absolute exact day, but using our calendar, this would have been on April the 17th in the year 474 BC. All right? And which is near the beginning of the Jewish year. Passover, this is right around the time of Passover, which is, at that time, was the first month of the year. All right, in the 13th day of the first month, the royal secretaries were summoned. They wrote out the script of each province in the language of all the people, Haman's orders to the king's satraps, the governors of the various provinces, and the nobles of the various people. These were written in the name of King Xerxes himself and sealed with his own ring. Dispatches were sent by couriers, not by Canada Post, to all of the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews. There's emphasis here. This was to be thorough. This was to be complete. This wasn't to just round up those you can catch. This was to thoroughly, utterly wipe out the Jewish people. And whenever you see verbs stacked up like that, it's a sign that this was meant to be complete, none left. Young and old, annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and little children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. And a copy of the text of the edict was issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality, so they would be ready for that day. And the day that it would have happened on would have been, just doing the math here, would have been March 7 in the year 473, using our calendar, 473 BC. So just imagine for a moment, if you're a Jewish person and you receive this edict and you hear about this, that all of your people are going to be cut off and killed, destroyed, killed, and annihilated, young, old, women, children, everybody, and you got 11 months to sit and ponder that. That in and of itself is torture beyond what any of us probably in our lifetime will ever come to know. And so the edict is sent out to everybody, and the couriers go, and the edict is issued from Susa, the capital city where Xerxes happened to be at this time, and there was no escape. You might think to yourself, okay, they got 11 months to figure out some sort of escape plan. But if you remember back to last time, the kingdom was so vast, and the Jewish people were not the powerful people. They were poor people, and there was no real means of escape. No way that within a year, except maybe for a few who might have been by the borders to somehow maybe sneak out of the country. But most of the Jews were in the Babylonian cities, where they had worked as servants and where they had made new lives for themselves. And some had gone back to Judah again to reconstruct the city there. This would have applied to them as much as to anybody because they were still part of the empire. And so they were trapped. There was nothing they could do. And they would be executed. And I just put a little picture of what a proclamation in those days, this is actually from a little bit earlier time, might have looked like. It talks about a document here, so perhaps this was something drafted on a parchment or something like that. But one of the ways they got the more permanent things out was to inscribe it on clay and bake the clay, and that way the message can't be changed. Whatever the document looked like, it was sent out to the kingdom. And then this kind of contrasting statement here. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. A kind of a tragic twist, here, after issuing this kind of a decree, the thing Haman wants to do is sit down and, have a couple drinks with the king to celebrate what he's done. And that, in a kind of a way, I think paves a little bit of the way for us to contemplate what is this story, what is this part of the story, what are the implications of this part of the story for our life today as Christian people. And what I'd like to do for a few moments that we have left here this morning is to contemplate together something we don't talk about very much at all in our church, and maybe Christians don't talk about often enough, generally speaking. And it's only in recent years that it's become more of a focus for churches, and that is the relationship this event has with the Holocaust in Germany in the Second World War. Sadly, this was not a one-of kind of event that, just this one time in the history of the world that someone tried to wipe out God's people. And this isn't even an event, or these sort of events aren't even, from the distant past of 1,000 years ago when people thought about doing these things. No, we only have to go back, 80 years or so to the beginning of the Second World War, to the war years, and to realize that these are the sorts of things that can happen today in our world, and not just to Jewish people, but there's ethnic cleansings and genocides all over the place. But what I'd like to do is take a few minutes just to talk about our response, or lack thereof, to what happened in Germany in the Second World War. Because as Lutherans, we have a unique and sometimes difficult connection to that whole time in the world's history. Because the one who gives his name to our church, not that he ever wanted to, was known to be of two minds regarding the Jews. On one hand, in the early stages of Luther's ministry, he was very warm towards Jewish people. He had rediscovered the gospel, and it was his firm belief that that this gospel was for all people, and that if the Jewish people around him were presented with that gospel in the right way, they would see the light, and they would come to the truth of the gospel. And so in one of his early writings, he talks about receiving them cordially, permitting them to trade and work with us, that they may have occasion and opportunity to associate with us, hear our Christian teaching, and witness our Christian life. A very kind of mission-oriented sort of thing, teaching and witnessing to who they are. But then by the later part of his life, and here we're talking about 1543, which is just 3 years before Luther dies, he writes another document where he has a far, far different tone. And he just comes right out and says it. We are at fault in not slaying them. And that document, or that statement, comes from a treatise that Luther wrote called On the Jews and Their Lies. And this is no small little tract. This isn't just a couple thousand-word pamphlet. This is a 65,000-word treatise. It's a huge document, written, as I said, 3 years before Luther dies. And in that document, he he talks very openly that Christians should be doing all kinds of things, that the synagogues and books and Jewish schools should be burned, that the homes of Jews should be torn down, that rabbis should be forbidden to preach on pain of loss of life and limb, that Jews should be enslaved, expelled, or even killed. It's, to our ears, a horrible document. And some people try to kind of excuse the document, and a little bit of this is potentially true, in that Luther was, by this point in time in 1543, not a well man himself. He was certainly past his prime theologically and personally, and he was beginning to suffer himself the pains of the work he had been doing, and but that only goes so far. You're having some bad times. That doesn't necessarily give you license to write something that is ultimately very hateful and very biased against a certain people. And where this connects up to the Holocaust in Germany is that this was a book that was referred to by Nazi leaders. It was held up, displayed for people at rallies and things like that. And it became a kind of a rallying cry. This book that should have been forgotten, this book that should have never been written, as one of my professors said in school, in talking about some of the stuff that Luther wrote later in his life, it would have been better for us if he had died before he said some of this stuff. Because it complicates his legacy. I mean, he was a sinner through and through. But, in strongest terms, this happened before Lutheran Church Canada became an autonomous church body, but back already in 1983, our parent church and now partner church in the United States, the Missouri Synod, adopted a resolution in convention saying that we absolutely deplore and detest these writings. We distance ourselves completely from them. But try as we might, sometimes that's easier said than done, not because the people of the world or because the people of the church hold to these views, no, but because we share the name, we share the heritage of the man who said these horrible things. And then that gets complicated even further by the role of the churches in Germany in the time of the Holocaust. And this has had an enormous effect on Christian relationships with Jewish people, on proclaiming the gospel to Jewish people. What kind of began to happen in many churches in Germany at that time is that a lot of what was heard from the pulpits more focused on nationalism than upon the confession of the faith. And we see this still today in churches where the flag is elevated to the same level, or maybe even in some instances slightly higher than the cross. And that it's all about the country, and God bless our land, and God keep our land, and God is with us, and presumably not so much with you. And anytime that happens in the world's history, that is a very lethal and dangerous mix. The gospel gets very quickly put aside. And then churches also took anti-Jewish actions. Any hymn, and we have a couple of them in our hymnal today, that have Jewish-based tunes. Anything that had that was just excised out. We won't do that at all. And a teaching began to arise in the churches as well, that Jesus was actually Aryan, that he may have been born into a Jewish family, but he was raised up in Galilee, and that was Gentile country, and so he's really one of us, and that because he was so vicious against the Pharisees, or so angry with the Pharisees, vicious is the wrong word, but because of the difficulty there, that he was really an enemy of the Jews, and that ultimately the Jews were at fault for crucifying him. And that legacy, now not every Christian in Germany held those ideas, don't get me wrong here, but some of the state churches and things like that, this is the sort of message that was proclaimed, not just Lutheran churches, but others as well. And this was the message that was out there. And it has complicated the legacy for Christians and Jews today. I consulted in my preparations this week with a person I've gotten to know from the Roman Catholic Lutheran Church Canada Dialogue here in Canada, a man who's a teacher at St. Michael's University in Toronto, and who has studied the relationship between Christians and Jews post-Holocaust in great detail. And one of the things that's happened among any number of Jewish people is that the hurt that is there, because there they were, and the Christians didn't come to their aid. Now, some certainly did. There are those wonderful stories of Christian individuals and some pastors who did remarkable things and heroic things to save the Jewish people. But in a nation that professed to be Christian, that was the minority. That's why those stories stand out, is because they were exceptions to the rule and not the rule. And this has made it harder then for people to be receptive to the Christian message, because there's this almost built-in animosity towards the church and to what the church has to say. And here we suffered this whole time, and you stood by and you didn't do anything about it, at least the vast majority of people. At any rate, we're running out of time, but I want to end it with a Bible passage that kind of, I think, grounds us in our thinking on these things. And it's from Romans chapter 7, verses 16 and 17, a verse that's very familiar to a lot of Christian people, that talks about not being ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God to salvation. That part, we know that really well, to everyone who believes. But then Paul puts it this way: to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. And perhaps that's the best place to end this particular lesson today, with a reminder that the heart of the Christian is to be open to God's people of the Old Testament, to the descendants of Abraham, to more cultivate the early spirit of Luther within us, that we reach out and with witness and in our lives, that there may again be a time when these people come to faith in Christ. With that, we'll leave things this morning. We just have a little bit I want to talk about at the start of next time, because this also has implications for us as well, because the church is also persecuted in the world. And I think there's some things that we can draw out of this as we move into the rest of the story. Let's close with a very, very brief word of prayer as we get ready for our worship service. Lord God, Heavenly Father, we thank you that your love is so vast, and forgive us when we let biases and prejudices get in the way of the gospel message. Strengthen us that we would be witnesses to all who suffer of your compassionate love. In Jesus' name, amen.